Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here for our April webinar. Really excited about this topic. We will have some time for some questions and answers at the end. So throughout the presentation, be thinking about what you might want to ask Dr. Freund. And if you could, you're also welcome to add your question into the chat box as well. But for now, if you could use the chat box to share your name and your pronouns, what organization or town, city, state you're in, what role you play in our work, that would be excellent. My name is Kara Kaikini, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Maine State Breastfeeding Coalition. And before we officially get started with the webinar, I wanted to make a few announcements. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides here. All right. First, this webinar has been approved for nursing credits. And to obtain credits for this, you will need to have attended 100% of the webinar and submit an evaluation. So at the end of the webinar, I'll put the evaluation link in the chat, and I'll also be emailing that to everyone who has registered. You can also, if you're not able to stay for the whole thing, you can also catch the webinar recording, which will be on our YouTube page. And for folks to receive credit after watching the recording, they need to complete a quiz and pass that quiz. And we would then send the certificate of completion out to you at that point. And you are welcome to scan that QR code now if you'd like to get to that evaluation so you can be ready to go. Or like I said, I will send that to you out after as well. And feel free to let me know if you have any questions about that process, either ask right in the chat or you can send me an email in response to your registration information. And I also want to take a moment to thank our annual partners for their support this year, especially WIC, sponsoring us at the patron level. Thank you so much. We are a small nonprofit who operates on the generosity of our sponsors and partners and on the generosity of our donors, and people who are paying for these webinars. So thank you so much for that. Speaking of webinars, we have a lot of exciting webinars coming up this year. We have our registration is ready for the June 4th webinar coming up next after this one, and we will slowly be adding the registration for the rest of the webinars as well. So stay tuned for that information. But keep these dates on your radar as well. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker. Dr. Freund's background is in family medicine, but she found her true passion in the second phase of her career when difficulties breastfeeding her third child introduced her to the field of breastfeeding and lactation medicine. Since 2024, she has been a moderator for Dr. Milk, an international Facebook community supporting physicians with breastfeeding challenges, and is currently pursuing her IBCLC and board certification in breastfeeding medicine. I'm not sure if anyone else is also taking their exam this month, but good luck to you, and to Dr. Rachel Freund. And Dr. Freund loves teaching, especially about that fascinating but neglected organ, the breast. So welcome, Dr. Rachel Freund. Thank you for being here. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Let me get my screen sharing going. And thank you so much for having me come talk to you about this topic, which I find fascinating and I think is quite under-recognized. Neurodivergence in breastfeeding and parenting. Okay. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay. So, so neurodivergence in breastfeeding and parenting. So our objectives are to understand the meaning of neurodivergence, recognize signs of it in a dyad, understand the impact of sensory differences, look at some specific challenges with autism and ADHD, and then some tools for your toolkit will be sprinkled throughout and a few extra at the end. So I have no financial disclosures. I will be using the terms like mom and mother, which should be taken inclusively. And then my lens, my background, my experience in this area comes from my personal experience with my family, and then also I live in Seattle, which is quite the tech hub, and tech and neurodivergence go together often. So here's some common situations that I'm sure you have seen. and wondering which of these could be due to neurodivergence. So an excessively fussy 5-month-old who's waking every hour at night to nurse, a 1-month-old who won't latch, has difficulty sensing the nipple, 6-month-old who won't nurse in a noisy room, is only content outdoors, a mother who's traumatized by her birthing experience, a lactating parent sensitive to pain, distressed by letdown sensations, and a parent overwhelmed by feeding schedule. So which of these could be due to neurodivergence? Well, they all may be. Of course, there are many reasons that could cause these things, but a neurodivergence could be one of them, and so it's something to keep in mind. So what is neurodivergence? Here's how I think about it. So we all have different settings, how fast our brain processes, how sensitive we are to stimuli, how flexible we are to adapt to change, our energy level, how we respond to social cues. And for neurotypical people, so what we'd call normal, regular, there's variation, right? We are all different. We all have variation in these little settings. But for someone with neurodivergence, there's more extreme variation. So they may have much more sensitivity to sensory differences or to sensory stimuli, or much less. They may have really fast brain processing speed or slower, and so on. So that's kind of one way that I conceptualize it. Does the world need neurodiversity, and is it a disability? So over here on the right are a bunch of different conditions which are considered neurodiversity or neurodivergent. Autism, ADHD, some people consider left-handedness, dyslexia, and so on. It's really more of a strength and weakness. So in some situations it can be a real strength, and in other situations it can be a real weakness. And so the way I think about disability is it's a mismatch with your environment. So if you're in the right environment that works with your skills, your way of thinking, it can actually be beneficial, but if you're not, then it can be a disability. And if we think back to, hundreds of years ago when people lived in tribal communities, there was a lot more opportunity to specialize. If you didn't like being around people, didn't like a lot of noise, you could go off in the forest and be a tracker, and use your fine detail sense, like with autism. You can use your fine detail sense to look for footprints and enemies and be very skilled at that, and that really works for you. Nowadays, we're kind of more expected to be well-rounded and kind of everyone do the same, live in kind of the same place and do the same thing. So it can be a little more challenging now. And then down here we have percentages for left-handedness, which is about 10%, and autism and ADHD together is around 15%, which is probably very much lower than it actually is because so many people go undiagnosed. Okay, this is my neurodivergent soup. This is my family. So my husband has mild autism. He was not diagnosed till age 40, around the time that my son, who's 10, was diagnosed with mild autism. And we realized that my husband has it, although we'd kind of always known he had some Asperger's-y type stuff, but we really realized it when we started learning about it with my son. And then my daughter in pink, she has ADHD and maybe a sprinkling of autism. And then my daughter in yellow, the littlest, she, we don't know yet, but she had a lot of sensory issues when she was a baby, so I'm guessing there's something going on, we just haven't figured out what. And then me, I think I'm neurotypical, though sometimes I start to question myself given my surroundings. Okay, so sensory neurodivergence. So sensory systems. So our sensory systems do a really big job for us. We get stimuli coming at us all the time. And so they receive the input, transmit it to the brain. The brain has to process all that information and then integrate all the different sensory systems together as a team to make sense of things. So here's an example of sensory processing and how this works. So I presume we all have eyes that are working and can see this picture, which has white and black areas, and some lines, some dots. You may also be able to see something else, something familiar. Perhaps you can detect a cow, a picture of a cow. And that is because our brain is taking the input from our eyes and is turning it into something meaningful. And that's called sensory processing. So the brain has to understand the input from the senses and tell us what's going on. If you can't see the cow here's a little hint. So this is outlining the cow's head, and the dark, really dark areas are the ears and the nose. So how many senses do we have? We actually have 8. So most people are familiar with the first 5, which I call the upper senses, vision, hearing, and so on. And then we have these other 3, which are called the foundational senses, and these are ones we don't really think about or talk about too much. So proprioception, so what's that? So that, it comes from pressure sensors within our joints. And whenever we're exerting a force with our joint, or our joint is positioned in a certain way, it's sending input to our brain to let our brain know how we're positioned and how much force we need to use for something. Like, for instance, how much force to crack an egg. You don't want to use too much or you end up with a big mess. You don't want to use too little or you don't crack the egg. And the proprioceptive sense is really important for calming our body, because when there's sustained pressure or force on a joint, it's very calming for our nervous system. And I'll talk more about that later. Then we have the vestibular sense, so that comes from the balance organs in our ear and in concert with our cerebellum in our brain. And that tells us about our movement. So where am I going? How am I moving? How fast am I moving? What orientation do I have? And that's really important, because I'm sure you've had the experience when you got really dizzy and then you stop spinning, but the world's still spinning around you. And for that time where the world's still spinning, it's almost like your eyes don't work properly, right? You can't make sense of what you're seeing. Sometimes it even seems like hearing's affected. And so if our vestibular system is not optimal, then it causes problems with our upper senses. And finally, we have the interoceptive sense. So that tells us information about what's going on inside our body. So am I hungry? Is my bladder full? Are my breasts full of milk? And it also tells us what our emotional state is, or helps us understand our emotions. So am I angry? Am I anxious? Is my heart beating fast because I'm afraid? Those sorts of things. And some people have trouble with that sense, and with all of them. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so sensory differences and difficulties. So some people can be very sensitive to sensory input, or certain types of sensory input. So we call that sensory sensitive or avoidant. And this little boy on the left here, he seems to be sensitive to light, sound, and perhaps touch, because he's got sunglasses, headphones, and he's got these kind of form-fitting soft pajamas, which are very commonly seen in people who are sensory sensitive. And then over here, we've got this pot full of noodles. This is my daughter, how she likes to eat noodles. She is sensory seeking, at least with noodles, and one type of noodle is never enough. She's got to have like multiple different types of textures and colors, and that's how she enjoys her noodles. And everyone has a unique sensory profile, so they might be sensory sensitive to sound, but sensory seeking with touch, or other combinations. And then there are sensory processing disorders. So these can cause trouble with reading, with being able to hear what people are saying in a crowd. And then the interoceptive or emotional sensory processing disorder is called alexithymia, which means no words for feelings. And so for someone with that condition, it can be really hard for them to recognize their own emotions and verbalize what they're feeling. Okay, and then there can be sensory dysregulation or sensory overwhelm. And the way I think about this is that any stimulus can be pleasant, but if it becomes too much, it becomes pain, right? So if we listen to music, music's lovely, it's very pleasurable, but if someone cranks up that volume high enough, it becomes pain. And so for someone who's very sensitive to a sensation, they are going to experience it as pain or as disturbing when someone else might not. It's very important to have a regulated sensory system because it interplays with our limbic system, our emotions, and then it's also important for cognition. If you're in pain, it's really hard to think clearly. So why does this matter? Well, it can cause lots of issues for the dyad, so both mom and baby, or both. And in my perception, 50% or more of neurodivergence daily struggles are due to sensory dysregulation. So it's a big deal. If we can fix the sensory dysregulation, everything else gets easier. Now, we do have a bit of a conflict between our biology and our culture. So we're still living with Stone Age biology, and our bodies want to be outdoors, having complex textures, which I call rich and right, doing a lot of pushing and pulling, heavy work, which is great for our proprioceptive calming, chewing on hard, tough food, and having slow reality speed entertainment, gazing at human faces. So that's what our biology wants. But our culture pressures us towards staying in our boxes, our little house, car, or office, gazing at a screen with these simple sensations like a 2D world. And so a healthy sensory diet is becoming more difficult in our modern life. Okay, so some sensory issues with the dyad. So I'm going to focus mostly on the infant for this part, but I'll talk about the parent a little bit too. So this baby, if if this baby could talk, he'd be saying, "Get rid of this scratchy sweater, someone dim the lights. And for the love of Pete, make that dog stop barking. My nervous system is in fight or flight." So unfortunately, our babies can't talk, but these are some signs, some kind of things to perk your interest if you see these with a baby, that they might be sensory sensitive. So just general fussiness, restlessness, waking a lot at night, really hard time getting transition to sleep or to feeding, frequently feeding to soothe. For the vestibular system, they may want to be constantly held or rocked and afraid of unstable positions. They might be fussy during the car ride, but then calm when the car stops. For auditory, they may startle easily to sudden noises, be really fussy in a noisy environment, want to go outdoors and just calm down right away when they go outdoors. They may like white noise. For tactile, they may prefer certain fabrics, and have high sensitivity to rashes, have a strong nipple preference. My daughter, when she was like maybe 6 months, we took her to the doctor because she was crying all the time, just seemed awful, and we thought maybe she had an ear infection. And when we got her under the fluorescent lights at the doctor's office and took off her clothes, we knew she had eczema, but we saw that it was just much more noticeable in the fluorescent light. And we realized, like, oh, it's the eczema that's making her so sad. But it wasn't even really that noticeable to us. But she had a lot of skin sensitivity. Here's a picture. This is not a baby, obviously, but I put this in here because this is kind of the quintessential neurodivergent kid on the playground. So if you go to the playground and you see a kid running around in form-fitting pajamas or a onesie and barefoot in all weather, that's like a real telltale sign. Okay, and then we each have a window of tolerance. So our window of tolerance is when we're relaxed, calm, we're socially engaged, we feel safe, we're creative, we're curious. If we get stressed or fearful, we can go up into this pink zone of fight or flight, where cortisol is flowing. If it becomes too extreme, we can go down into hypoarousal, where we're immobilized with fear and kind of in hibernation a bit. For neurodivergent people, it's even more essential to be in the window of tolerance to function well. And they often have a narrower window of tolerance, so it's more challenging. If we stay in the fight or flight for too long, the cortisol can become elevated, and that may persist even after going back into the window of tolerance, which is important to remember for babies with sleep. Okay, so for a baby with sensory issues, you may hear the parent say, "The stars all have to be aligned." The baby only feeds well if everything is just right. A little sleepy, not too hungry, has to be quiet, just the right milk flow, so on. And same for sleep. Everything has to be just right. You may hear the terms, they're a 0 to 100 baby, high needs, highly sensitive baby. And sensory stuff might not be the only thing going on. So neurodivergence is associated with symptomatic tongue tie. And we don't really know exactly why, but it could be that these babies just have a lower tolerance for irritation, and it's irritating to try and nurse with a tongue tie. But there's also this connection between hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome with neurodivergence, and that's a disorder of collagen. It makes joints very flexible and can cause pain. Can also, and it is that condition is associated with tongue tie as well. So there's some connection there. So some people might say to these, babies or kids who are sensitive to something, don't they just need to get used to it? Just have more of the stimulus and then you'll get used to it. Well, yes and no. So they do need a continued rich and varied sensory input for their nervous system to develop properly and for it to kind of make sense of all these stimuli that are coming in. But it's best if that happens while they're in their window of tolerance or near it. So you want to kind of expose them to a stimulus, but if it becomes too much, decrease it, drop back into the window of tolerance, and then kind of expose them again. And then if they start getting stressed, drop back into the window of tolerance. If you stay in the prolonged stress mode, then it increases their sensitization to the stimulus, and they're more likely to react strongly to it the next time they encounter it. Also, if they stay in the prolonged stress mode too long, they can develop a trauma response to the stimulus. So an example of that is my son. When he was young, we would go to birthday parties, and at some point during the birthday party, everyone would just suddenly burst into loud songs singing happy birthday. And he was noise sensitive and also startle sensitive. And so it just really, threw him for a loop. And eventually he didn't want to go to birthday parties anymore. He hated the song. He didn't want us to sing it for him at home, even quietly. So that was, I could have perhaps handled that better if I had understood things better back then. And then we can't learn well when stressed. So with the cortisol flowing, the brain just doesn't learn well. Grandparents, friends, and society may have trouble accepting this perspective, that you don't just need to get used to it, and that you kind of have to be a little more sophisticated. Okay, and then just when we had it all figured out, the baby changes. So there's disruption with developmental changes. So with leaps, with teething, everything kind of goes haywire again. And the upper senses seem to come online more around 6 months. This is something I've noticed. So hearing, light sensitivity, touch, and then taste. And sleep is greatly affected when these changes happen. There's one more thing I wanted to mention. So avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So this is linked to autism more than ADHD. And it may onset with starting solids. So what it is a combination of sensory issues, fear of choking or gagging, and generally low appetite. And so what happens with these kids or babies is they just decide eating is scary, I'd rather not eat. Or eating is scary, I'm only going to eat certain foods that I consider safe, which are generally very homogeneous textures and easy to eat. And I do wonder if this happens at younger ages before starting solids, and maybe we don't recognize it as such, but I don't know. And this is treated with OT and speech pathology, and for older kids with counseling. Okay, so some strategies for dealing with sensory issues with babies. We want to listen to the baby. So what's the baby telling us they don't like? What's the baby telling us is really bothering them? And then validating the parents. So they're usually in tune with the baby. They may present as slightly panicky, and that's actually a reasonable response, because when you're dealing with an unpredictable baby with these extreme reactions, it causes anxiety and to the mildly traumatized. And so it's really important not to look at the parents and say, oh, you're the problem. It can be very gaslighting and isolating for the parent. So then we want to decrease the noxious stimuli. So whatever it is that's bothering the baby, you try to take care of that. And do slower transitions. So an example would be you're inside a dim house and you want to go outside into the bright sunshine, and you're taking the baby with you. So you want to find a way to make that change more gradual. Like, do you give baby a hat and sunglasses and stay near the house on the porch for a little while and then go out into the bright sunlight, something like that. It's really important to be proactive with a healthy sensory diet throughout the day, because the whole day matters. And I'll talk more about that later, and I also have a handout at the end of the slide with some great ideas, kind of a menu to choose from, so that you're always working on something to help the baby's sensory system when they're calm, to prepare them for what they're going to encounter. These babies may need more naps and sleep. And then if things are really not going well, a great option is occupational therapy. So for kids and infants, occupational therapy is focused on sensory issues and developmental issues. It's not like for adults where it's trying to, get you an ergonomic keyboard. And there's this really great program that all the states have. It's called the Local Early Intervention Program. And babies or kids qualify for this. It's birth to 3 years old, qualify for this if they fall outside the developmental norm for their age. So my daughter, my youngest, qualified because it was taking me an hour to get her to sleep every time I was trying to get her to nap or bed. And then she was also very sensitive to sounds. So when I would turn on the faucet and the water would run, she would startle, things like that. So you don't have to have autism or whatever because you really can't diagnose that in early ages anyway. But if they fall outside the developmental range. And then other things like body work and so on can be helpful as well. Okay, so there are targeted strategies, and I'm not going to go into in detail right now. There's a handout at the end of this presentation, and I believe will be emailed to you with a whole bunch of ideas for how to target on different systems. But I will just say that the proprioceptive system is a great place to start for calming baby. So things like deep pressure, a sleep sack, baby wearing, squeezes of babies like kind of big muscle groups, joint compressions, which so joint compressions is when, this is my little baby here. So if you put one hand on either side of a joint, so I'm holding the foot and I'm holding the leg, if I push linearly into the joint, kind of gently but firmly, and I kind of pulse, so it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. That gives a lot of input to the joint and really calming for the nervous system. And so you can do that on the ankle joint, the knee joint, the hip joint, the wrist, elbow, shoulder. And so that's a really great tool. Of course, you would do it when baby's calm. And then for seeking, again, deep pressure, crawling, climbing, and so on. Okay, so here's an example. So this little baby, so this was from an internet forum that I'm a part of. So 7-month-old, she loves her bath. Whenever she gets in the bath, she like scoots down so her ears are completely submerged, and then she lies there singing to herself, very happy. Then when they get her out of the bath, she's okay, but then when they take her to her changing table and try to put her pajamas on, she just loses her mind, screaming, crying, acting like she's in pain. There were a lot of responses to this poster, but I liked this one. So they said, I'm guessing it's a sensory or transition thing. Maybe try some deep pressure cuddles after the tub, but before getting changed. And then I said, you know, she may be submerging her ears for sensory seeking or to block out noise. And then let's try slowing down the transition, maybe with some white noise. And then the transition from wet to dry, maybe we could do some lotion or have her play in the tub for a while without the water. And then the mom said that she was chewing on a toy duck. And so I said, that's great because chewing is very regulating. And then maybe you could also try some food. And so the mom said, things were helping, so they were giving her a toy, heating the towel, and she was doing better. Okay, so signs of sensory sensitivities for the parent. So they may be irritable, anxious, have a short fuse, have trouble falling asleep, maybe highly sensitive to pain, noise, breastfulness, wet clothes. They may choose to wear their clothing inside out to avoid tags or seams rubbing against their skin. They may be doing sensory seeking activities for calming, like exercise, going barefoot, having fidget toys, and they may have a higher need for sleep or alone time. So this is some ideas for things people can try. So for proprioception, so you want a sustained pulling or pushing force on the joints is very grounding and calming. So anything where it's like kneading, pushing, pulling, chewing, stretching, putting this stretchy band on the legs of a chair can be really great. And then your feet can kind of push against it while you're doing something else like nursing. We already talked about joint compressions, how that works. It's a linear force toward the joint and pulse it maybe like 4 or 5 times. Baby wearing, sleep sacks, other things are rhythmic motion and tapping. For auditory, for the parent, it's usually about decreasing stimuli. So headphones, there's these interesting high-tech earplugs that are available now that block some noise, some sounds and not others. Being outside is really awesome. And then white noise or water running. For visual, so blocking bright lights with sunglasses, having natural light or indirect light, pastel colors, a red night light, and then something nice to look at, so like the sand and water scene. For tactile, I really love this Nido cube over here on the left. So it's like a stress ball, but it just really has a really nice feel to it. The Ono roller is a thing you can kind of roll in your hand. And there's therapy putty, other tactile things. Ice can be a really good sensory input. And of course, being outside on the grass, touching tree bark, touching bushes. For baby, water play, or for adults, I guess, being in the water, touching soap bubbles, lotion, and then preferred fabrics usually are polyester, something soft and smooth, or maybe fleece. Generally knitted fabrics, and sometimes 100% cotton can be irritating. So some inexpensive options. So if you don't want to pay $40 for a Nido roller, you could just take 2 markers and roll them back and forth in your hand. Play-Doh, and then for a stretchy band, there's usually a flat bicycle inner tube lying around somewhere, and you can just cut the metal part off, and that makes a great stretch band. And for kids and babies, we want to progress them gradually. So they could start with just water play, and then add bubbles, and then add toys, and then add some scents, and then switch to shaving cream, which doesn't wash off as easily. So you kind of have to work up to higher levels of difficulty. Okay, so now we're going to kind of focus more on the mother or the lactating parent and talk about autism and ADHD. So if we think about a neurotypical person or neurotypical brain versus someone with autism or ADHD, it's kind of like they're running different operating systems. So if you think about an Apple phone versus an Android phone, they both are phones, they both can text and call and do these things, but there are apps that work well that work on an Apple phone. You can't just use that same app on an Android phone. You need different tools, different things. And sometimes an Apple phone is better at certain things and an Android phone is better at certain things. So they're kind of just different operating systems. So for autism. So autism is highly genetic. There are 800 plus genes that have been recognized contribute to autism. And there are 4 subtypes of autism, which I'm not going to go into right now. If you look at intellectual function, so about 30% of people with autism have impaired intellect or intellectual disability, and about 40% have higher than average intellect. And so those are greater percentages than you would see in the typical population. And there's a 3% prevalence, 4-to-1 male to female. It's likely much higher prevalence because many people are not diagnosed. So I know many, many people with autism, and very few of them are actually formally diagnosed, so they're not contributing to any statistics. No one in my family, my immediate family, is diagnosed. So anyway, and there are a lot of famous people with autism, and I would say that for these people, their success was largely due to their autism. So for instance, Dan Aykroyd is one example. So he had a fixated interest, which is common with autism, a fixated interest on ghosts and police. And from there we got Ghostbusters. And then I have this picture of a train track here. It's a very simplistic analogy, but in my experience, people with autism do well. They thrive when things are orderly, predictable, as it should be, and going in a direction that works for them. So that's why I have this idea of the train track. And if they get derailed from that, that's when things become very challenging. And that's not always true for everyone, but that's just kind of my simplistic way of thinking of it. There is some evidence that breastfeeding decreases autism severity. So it's not going to change someone from profoundly disabling autism to high intellect autism, because those are different subtypes, but it does seem to have an effect on the presentation of the traits, and we can talk more about that at the end if people are interested. Okay, there's this saying in the neurodivergent community: if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because there's a lot of variation and people are unique. And so I'm going to say a lot of things about autism, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because everyone is very different. So here's an example. So this is the autism spectrum showing different traits, and I've kind of outlined where some people I know fall, and so these are two different people, and you can see that their outlines look very different. Okay, so how do we identify autism? Well, the typical diagnostic methods are geared for young children, and so they're not as applicable for infants or adults or people who are more mild or unique. However, sensory differences are a big clue. So that's something that tends to present early in babies and persist. People with autism may have communication differences, so they may have different ways of doing eye contact, different ways of talking, different tones of voice. But they may have learned to mask, meaning pretend to be neurotypical. And so someone who tends to not make eye contact may have been told, you don't make eye contact. And so now they have a very intense gaze when they're trying to talk to someone because they're trying to compensate. There may also be cognitive differences, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Theory of mind, that's empathy, so being able to understand that someone else has a different perspective and that's okay, or that someone else doesn't have the same information that you know. Rigidity, so that's difficulty being flexible, difficulty adapting to changes or situations that you don't like, not liking surprises. They may have, well, usually often have a fixated or special interest. So there's something that they're really interested in, that they want to talk about all the time, that they spend a lot of time doing, that they attain expert level knowledge in. And they may have multiple of these, but they're intensely interested in something. And then what friends do they choose? What identity do they choose? So if they're choosing to be friends with people who are autistic or neurodivergent, or if they're identifying as a nerd, these are kind of clues. So I have some characters from media over here. So Amelia Bedelia, pretty sure she's autistic because she has difficulty with communication. She takes everything very literally, and she has this fixated interest on baking. And then the Mandalorian, he's very rigid, right? He's like, it is the way. There's only one way. And then Urkel, he's like the quintessential nerd, right? Also has some odd communication style. And then the character from Queen's Gambit, fixated interest on chess and very skilled at that, difficulty handling life in general. Okay, so common breastfeeding and parenting challenges with autism. So there can be a lot, but these are the two that I am highlighting. So sensory overwhelm. So once you have a baby, things change. You may be deprived of your prior coping strategies. Alone time is a big one. Time to wind down, de-stress, not be stimulated. May have a narrower window of tolerance due to changes in the brain and body from pregnancy. New sensory demands with the baby, and then prone to meltdown and shutdown. So meltdown is like exploding, like bah, and shutdown is kind of like withdrawing, maybe unable to talk even. And then difficulty obtaining support. So people with autism have communication differences, cognitive differences, and that can make it challenging to obtain support when they need it. So here's one example of potential cognitive differences, and this is just an analogy. I'm not saying that autistic people necessarily do this with looking at a picture of a forest, but this is kind of an example. So for neurotypical people, they tend to have big picture thinking, top-down analysis, and assumptions. So look at this picture. This looks like a picture I've seen before. This is a forest. Okay, so that's a pretty fast conclusion, and it's assumption-based. For a person with autism, they tend to look bottom up at the fine details and process those details and analyze them, and that leads them to a conclusion. So for instance, they look at this, say, lots of needles. Needles are connected to branches, connected to trees. There are lots of trees, therefore this is a forest. So it's a slower way of coming to a conclusion, but it's more precise and less error prone. So you can see how in society we really need both of these ways of looking at things. Okay, and then communication. So people with autism may struggle with noticing or interpreting body language, tone, facial expressions, and they're more likely to interpret things negatively. So their brain, it either has a large amygdala or it acts like it does, and it's always looking for what's wrong, what's wrong here. And so they're more sensitive to criticism and to looking at things as glass half empty. And then they need explicit communication, which I'll explain later, saying what to do or the goal to aim for. So there's a really wonderful researcher, Amy Grant, in the UK, and she has done lots of research with autistic women. And this article here, Autistic Women's Experiences with Infant Feeding, she talks about a lot of perspectives that they have, and remembering that most of the people that we work with have just recently given birth. This is how autistic women describe their birth experience. Majority was negative. They described it as traumatic or dehumanizing, loss of control, lots of pain, that they weren't listened to, that they had to mask, they were afraid to say that they were autistic, that people viewed them as aloof, and they felt unable to communicate their needs and had difficulty understanding the care plan. So just to mention that, because if that was their experience with birth, they're coming off of that and then they're going into breastfeeding. Now the good news is that she found that over 50% of autistic mothers found breastfeeding enjoyable or positive the majority of the time. They mentioned things like enjoying the sensation of baby's body against theirs, even though they didn't like some of that sensation, found breastfeeding comforting and felt the oxytocin, felt that breastfeeding helped them overcome the feeling of being overwhelmed and shutting down. And some of them mentioned they would have found dealing with bottles harder, although some of them did say that they thought the ritual of making bottles was somewhat relaxing. The challenges were mostly sensory. So one person said, I have extreme aversion and my skin crawls. I have to put her down sometimes while feeding. I really struggled with feeling wet from leaked milk and getting wet clothes. One person said, I felt like I had an old-fashioned telephone ringing in my breasts, and I can still feel it again just thinking about it, even though I haven't breastfed for 9 years. And then the intensity was overwhelming at times, and the need to be physically present prevented using usual coping strategy of time alone. So here are some strategies for working with people with autism. So for the sensory issues, so if someone's hypersensitive, they could nurse while rocking or bouncing or chewing gum or flicking a rubber band on their wrist. They could use distraction, and then making sure that they have a good sensory diet throughout the day. Some people found it helpful to walk, take a walk or take a shower right before nursing. For people who have nursing aversion, they could pump. One person had their partner hold the baby while they nursed. I'm not really sure how that worked, but that's what they found helpful. And then with nursing aversion, just a reminder that we should ask about sexual trauma, because that can be a reason for nursing aversion. For sensory overwhelm, so when they're just, they've reached their max, working on proprioceptive grounding, sleep, and then self-acceptance, and getting help, obviously, from other people. So self-acceptance, it's realizing I'm not a bad parent. This is just more challenging for me. This is who I am. And then because of the hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos connection, we need to be alert for vasospasm and elastic nipples, because that's more common. Now, some people with autism are hyposensitive, so they don't have as much sensation, perhaps skin sensation. So they may need to visually check their breasts every day in a mirror to make sure they're not getting any wounds or anything. And then for communication, so speaking slowly with pauses can be really helpful for people with autism. They tend to have slower processing speed because they're doing all that deep analysis. and then direct explicit communication, which I'll explain in a minute. And then if they're going to do counseling or peer support, it needs to be autistic specific. So typical methods can be actually harmful or unhelpful. Okay, so what is explicit or direct communication? So it's saying what to do. So let's imagine that this woman, I'm trying to guide her through this field of holes, and I say something like, oh no, you're getting too close to that hole. Oh no, now you're too close to another one. Oh, watch out. Pretty soon she's just going to feel paralyzed and she's just going to stop and not move. Saying what to do is like playing a game of Battleship. So it's like, walk 3 steps forward and then 2 steps to the left. Now 1 step forward. Now 3 steps to the right. Something like that. And you can imagine how she can trust me and feel confident to proceed if that's the way I'm communicating with her. So kind of imagining that the person has a blindfold on and I have to be very explicit with my instructions. Another option is to describe the end state that we're going for. So if they have something to aim for, they know what the end state looks like, that can be really empowering. So here's an example of unclear communication. So put nose to nipple. Okay, what does that mean? Well, maybe it means this. Oh, how lovely. Look at that baby, ready to nurse. Or maybe it means this. Nose is still to nipple. Or heavens, maybe it means this. The mom's nose by the baby's nipple. So better communication, more direct, could be something like, why don't you lay your nipple in the baby's nipple notch above their lip, pointing at their nose? So that kind of tells you where to position things exactly. Or describing the end state. I want baby's chin in your areola and him sniffing your nipple. So kind of describing what you want and then letting her figure out how to get there. So people with autism have strengths and challenges, and kind of listed some of them here. Some great ones are unstoppable persistence. So if they are confident in the direction they're going, they can just go, nothing will stop them. Wanting to do what's right, alert to potential problems, attention to detail. If things get off track, like with sensory overwhelm, they can have meltdown or shutdown. And then challenges with being exhausted by masking, having the negativity bias, derailed by changes or surprises, and so on. Okay, so now we're going to talk about ADHD. So autism and ADHD are kind of like 2 sides of the same coin. There are a lot of similarities, and then there are some things that are just totally opposite. And some people do have both, which is, the new term is ADHD. Okay, so ADHD. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's kind of a misnomer, which we'll get into, but that is the name. So it's very inherited and diagnosed more in males in children, but in adults it's actually 1-to-1 male to female. And many people go undiagnosed, again, like autism. A lot of parents actually get diagnosed when their kid gets diagnosed, because it's recognized so much more nowadays. And there are many famous people. ADHD tends to give you optimism, energy, and a need for an outlet. And so got a lot of athletes, comedians, actors, and so on. Bill Gates and Einstein are on both lists because they have both autism and ADHD. I have this picture of a Ferrari here because a person with ADHD has a fast, powerful brain. They have fast processing speed, lots of energy, and so they've got all this power, but then it's like trying to control a Ferrari with bicycle brakes. It's hard to stop and change directions. Okay, so how does this work in the brain? So for a neurotypical person, there are kind of 2 modes. There's the default mode, which is when you're kind of relaxing, imaginative, socially engaged, aware of your surroundings. And then there's the task positive network, which is when you're really focused on the task. So like you're reading intently or you're trying to figure something out. And there you're very focused on one thing and you're not really aware of your surroundings very much. And there's this sort of reminder system that reminds you to stay focused on the task. So it keeps reminding you, stay focused, do this, stay on this one thing. Or if you've been doing that for too long, it reminds you to take a break and go to the bathroom, or go to your doctor's appointment or whatever. For people with ADHD, they get many fewer reminders from this reminder system. So they don't get as many reminders to stay focused on the task. And if they're doing a task that's very interesting, they don't get as many reminders to stop and do something else. So, the reminder to go to the doctor's appointment, they might not get that. So they just can hyper-focus. The other thing that's different with ADHD is that the two modes are kind of overlapping or leaking into each other, and so they're not as distinct. It's kind of like they're always in the default mode even when they're doing a task. And so this is kind of like, trying to watch two different TVs. One's playing CNN and one's playing an action movie. It's tricky. Something that can help them stay focused on the task is a surge of dopamine. So if there's something really interesting in the task, that can keep them engaged. If there's a person doing it with them, that gives a surge of dopamine. Or if there's a reward that they're going for, or food as a reward, that can create a surge of dopamine that can help them maintain focus in the task. And there's pros and cons to this. So the con's kind of obvious. It can be hard to do the thing you're trying to do without getting distracted. The pro is that because a person with ADHD is kind of always in the creative, imaginative mode, they can come up with out-of-the-box solutions for things and have these really creative ideas. Some other aspects of ADHD, so it's not just trouble focusing and hyperactivity and fidgeting. They tend to have trouble regulating emotions, may have a poor sense of time. It's called time blindness. They don't sense time passing in the same way. A lot of anxiety and shame, because they're always getting told you're doing it wrong or stop doing that thing. Executive dysfunction problems, so with organizing, planning, and then poor impulse control. Poor impulse control is a big one. So their brain's going so fast that they just do the thing and then they think, oh, wait, should I have done that? Because of this, there are a lot of risks with ADHD, so unplanned pregnancies, substance use, car accidents, suicidality. And so life expectancy for someone with ADHD is actually decreased from a typical person, average around 8 years. And then again, if you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. Everyone's very unique. Some people struggle with things that other people don't. Okay, so some common breastfeeding and parenting challenges for people with ADHD. So again, sensory issues. They might be sensory seeking or sensory sensitive or a mix. Difficulty with emotion regulation and identifying emotions. And they, after they have a baby, are often deprived of prior coping strategies, like exercise is a big one for people with ADHD. And then another big area is executive function. So there's just a lot more to manage when you have a baby. And there's sleep deprivation, which makes all that harder. And there's a loss of prior routines that were helping with that. So here's some strategies for ADHD. And I will just say that if breastfeeding is going well, with ADHD, breastfeeding is much easier than dealing with formula or pumping and bottles. And so it's a boon to them. So sensory issues. So again, I mentioned exercise. That's super important. Having a healthy sensory diet throughout the day. Fidget toys can be helpful. Skin-to-skin co-regulation can be really great if they like that, sensory-wise. So getting that oxytocin flowing for mom and baby. Minimizing distractions and overstimulation. And then finding comfortable nursing positions because they are more prone to hypermobility issues. For executive function, forgetfulness and time blindness, so we want to make sure to prioritize sleep, exercise, snacks is a big one. Food has a powerful effect on people with ADHD. And then listening to body cues and trusting instincts. So this can actually be really healing for someone with ADHD because their whole life they've been told, stop doing that. You're doing that wrong. Why are you doing that? And so they kind of have this, they do carry a lot of shame and kind of a distrust of their own instincts. But for breastfeeding, you want them to listen to their body cues and uh, trust their instincts. So that's it can be very healing. Visuals work really well for people with ADHD, rewards, and keeping items at every nursing station. And then for medication and coaching and counseling, it's kind of like peanut butter and jelly. They go best together. I know not everyone here is a prescriber, but I just put this in. So methylphenidate is the preferred medication in breastfeeding, just different from pregnancy. And then there's some medication resources down at the bottom. And Postpartum Support International has a free consult for prescribers. And then there are strengths and challenges, which I'm just going to move through in the interest of time. And we want to focus on strengths. So find out what they can do well and focus on that. Okay, the dyad's also within community. So there may be others outside the dyad that have neurodivergence issues, the husband, the partner, the autistic grandmother, and this can increase relationship stress. And then society has this expectation for people to be neurotypical. If you're left-handed and you've tried to use right-handed scissors, it doesn't work super well. And then there's a role change to mother or parent that has to be re-navigated with the partner in society. Neurodivergent babies tend to have higher needs, and this may not be obvious to others, and so invalidation is common. Your baby seems fine. Maybe you're the problem, which creates increased isolation at the time of greatest need for support. And then they may have difficulty making friends with other parents and interacting in peer support groups. The late great Penny Simpkins said that birthing is when parents are made. So, it's this really critical time in the development of the parent, the development of the family, and so they really need support. So like you mentioned, they might be previously supported by certain systems and routines, and then they have an increased need for support just when their supports fail, difficulty obtaining new support, leading to increased risk for postpartum depression, and so on. This is where we can help. So we can notice what's going on and we can help them obtain support, leading to a supported mom and family and a thriving dyad. Just a few more quick tools for your toolkit. So if you're working with someone with neurodivergence, you might want to suggest that they write out a little about me, saying what their learning style is, what works best for them, what doesn't work. And then these are some examples of how a care plan could be modified. So it could be a detailed written care plan, or it could be a visual care plan, which works well for people with ADHD. So if the usual tools aren't working, I'm not saying, change everything, but if the usual things aren't working, then this could be an option. In summary, diversity makes a richer world. Neurodivergence can be amazing and disabling. Try to raise the question, even if you don't know the answers, and the parent may do the research on themselves and find their own answer. Be alert to sensory differences, because that's the key usually. And then neurodivergent people need neurodivergent strategies. Thank you so much for the good work that you do. And then here are some resources. I put arrows next to the ones that I think are really great. Postpartum Support International has a free ADHD online support group, which is really awesome. And then there's these videos on autistic experiences by Amy Grant, which are short and very helpful. Some YouTube influencers that I've found helpful, and some books. I haven't read this one on the left. It's by Amy Grant, the researcher, so I suspect it's wonderful. And then this one over here, Breastfeeding, Autism and ADHD. There are very few books on this topic. I only found 2 on Amazon. And this one is by an IBCLC. So I have not read it, but it seems good. Okay, and then here is the handout, which I believe will be emailed to you with more details about how to deal with babies with sensory sensitivities, strategies to try. And then this is a healthy sensory menu for baby, things to try when baby's calm and they're tolerating it, to help their nervous system develop well and tolerate other sensations. And then here's one for parents. Okay, so that's it. And I will stop screen sharing here.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, really thorough. A lot of really wonderful information. I think I'll want to watch this again myself. Um, Does anyone have any questions? I know some folks might have to leave, but if we have Dr. Freund here now, so if you have any questions based on this really wonderful information, please feel free to type in the chat or go ahead and unmute or turn your camera on. Um, and I appreciated being reminded of Amelia Bedelia myself. I was a big fan as a kid, and the Ghostbusters, of course. But that was great. And I loved hearing about the experiences that people have shared, like feeling like an old telephone ringing in their breast. That's really neat to be able to have an understanding of what their experiences are or can be. And like you said, it's one person's experience can be very different than another. So thank you for kind of going over the landscape of what that can all look like.
Sure.
Any questions? Thanks for the comment and compliments. And so I put the evaluation in the chat, and I will be sending that out by email as well. Once you submit your evaluation, we'll be sending you a certificate of attendance. And the slides, are you okay with me sending? I know you sent me the PowerPoint. I can put that into a handout format.
Yeah, yeah.
And you also sent a separate handout too. So I'll be sending those out. So thank you for your patience by the time I get that out to you. Feel free to email me if you would like something more urgently. I'm seeing Brittany say, I have seen neurodivergence and sensitivities coming out in pumping experiences with all the different suck pull options that pumps may have, and that she personally struggled with many different patterns. Yeah, it's a great point. There's so many sensory components to these experiences. And it's helpful for us to really think about that and understand how that can be processed differently for people. Excellent. All right. Do you have would you mind typing in your contact info so that
Sure.
I know who?
Yeah, it's also it's on the first slide, but
Okay.
yeah, I will do
Yeah.
that.
So have contact info if you have questions.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you
And
so
I'll
much.
just
Yeah.
mention, so I mentioned that it seems like autism severity is somewhat modified by breastfeeding. And so the theory behind that is that it's probably a couple things, but one is the free fatty acids from the HMOs, the human milk oligosaccharides, seem to be calming for brain inflammation. And then the other thing is these babies seem to have a really big amygdala, it's a really big fear response. And so maybe the skin to skin and like contact with breastfeeding maybe helps like modulate that. So those are kind of and then epigenetics. So those kind of the ideas there.
Yeah, fascinating. So both, the human milk itself, but also the contact that comes along with breastfeeding.
Yeah, that's the theory.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Freund, and for everyone else for taking the time out to learn more about this really interesting topic. And I look forward to staying connected. And we'll actually have you back again at the end of the year, I believe, to do
Yeah.
another presentation.
Yep.
So thank you very much.
All right.
Have
Thank
a,
you for listening.
have a wonderful day.
Thanks.